Call this meeting to order. This is the Bath Charter Township Board of Trustees special board meeting of Wednesday, July 22nd, in a joint meeting with our friends from the Planning Commission. So I'm calling the meeting to order here at 6 o'clock, and I know my colleague, the esteemed chair of the Planning Commission, would like to call his own meeting to order.
We'll call the order of the Planning Commission of Bath Township.
All right, thanks. We'll start with our roll call, and then we'll go over to the Planning Commission roll call.
Mr. Kinslet.
I'm here.
Ms. Butler-Kielder here. Ms. Wilson here. Ms. Hagerman here. Ms. Kellerman
Here.
Mr. Cosby
Here.
Mr. Montrose
Here.
Thank you.
Planning Commission. Vice Chair Baker. Here. Commissioner Bolter. Here. Commissioner Craner. Here. Chair Wright. Here. Commissioner Almerigi. Here. And Commissioner Severy. Here. Trustee Hager.
Here. Still here.
Item 2 on our agenda is the civic reflection. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance and end with a moment of silence. So please stand and join us if you're able in the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Now a moment of silence. Thank you. Item 3 on the Board of Trustees agenda is approval of the agenda. I have not heard about any changes from any board members or staff. Anybody have any changes for the agenda tonight? Would anyone like to put forward a motion to approve? Motion to approve.
I'll second.
We have a motion to approve the agenda as presented in a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, we'll take a voice vote. All those in favor of approving the agenda tonight say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. Does the Planning Commission need to approve their own agenda, or can we keep trucking?
Your agenda.
Disclosure of conflicts of interest of board members. And I have a conflict of interest. We own a data center. Not yet.
Second.
Got it? So we will move on to item 5, which is public statement 1. This is limited to 3 minutes, designated for statements concerning agenda items tonight. There is a second opportunity. There's not a second opportunity. Oh, there's a second opportunity at the end of the meeting for an additional 3 minutes where you can talk about any township issue you'd like to speak to, but the first one is about agenda items only. If you would like to address the board on a public statement, please step up to the lectern, introduce yourself, and we'll start your 3 minutes. Would anyone like to address the board tonight? Seeing none, I will close the Board of Trustees public statement and turn it over to my colleague from the Planning Commission to open his own public statement.
Anyone want to make a public statement regarding the agenda? Have another 3 minutes. No? Hearing none. Let's move on.
All right, thank you. Item 6 is new business. Items for introduction. We have a training session. What local governments should know about data centers. We have Madeline Kroll here, Clean Energy Land Use Specialist from the University of Michigan Center for Empowering Communities. Before we invite her up, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about why we're doing this tonight. To be clear, we have no proposals for data centers ahead of us. We have no votes planned on that, but we know these issues are coming for communities across the country and across our state. None of us as board members are experts in data centers. Our staff has expertise, but is not experts necessarily in data centers, and so we thought before those things come to our door, we should know more about them. We should understand what rights we have as a board, what rights we have as a community, what are the right questions we should be asking, where do we not have authority. So we thought we should do that before these things come and knocking on our door. Our planning commissioners have been talking about these issues as well, and we thought it was a great way to share the time tonight to learn more about that. So to be clear again, there's no active proposal. We have heard no introduction. There's nothing before the board or the planning commission at this time. We are being proactive to learn more about these issues so we can understand them better when undoubtedly they will come. So with that, I'll turn it over to our special guest, Ms. Kroll. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me just make sure you guys hear me. Okay. Hello, everyone. I am so glad to be here. I'm very grateful that you've invited me. And I
want to also applaud the fact that you are doing proactive education and trying to learn more about this rather than it's not clear. Thank you, Miles. I also just speak low, so if you come like, please raise your hand and I'll use my teaching voice. Okay, I think what governments should know about data centers. I want to preface this, Miles, if you could click me to the next slide. I want to make clear that usually my daily bread and butter I earn by being a planning professional that works at the University of Michigan, advising local government advising, but providing education to local governments about renewable energy projects. So big solar, big wind, big energy storage, battery energy storage facilities. That is what I've been doing at the University of Michigan for the past 4 years. EGLE, or the Department for Environment Regulation, EGLE and Energy, that is where the state energy office sits in the state. They are paying my gas tonight to be here tonight. Sometimes those questions come up, who are you working for? So EGLE has really been funding this work of our team for the past now 7 years to help local governments understand the pros and cons of big renewable energy projects and help translate that into zoning and into planning. So I'm not necessarily a data center expert, which you might think, then why is she here tonight? I think there are a lot of things that we can extrapolate and learn from the renewable energy experience, because many of these data centers really want to go where big solar and wants to go to. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So that said, our team generally is rather new to data centers, but the reason we have been really digging into this in the past 9 months or so is because I work with a lot of townships across the state, and my colleague is working with a lot of cities, working on all sorts of things, sustainability. And both her and I have heard the same question of, oh gosh, data centers, what do we need to know? Because they're urban and rural places across Michigan are having the same kind of questions. And so we really dug in and have developed or brought out in February the results of all of our self-taught learnings, which is this guidebook that I brought a couple of copies of. You can also pull this up online, or I can send you the link. You can print out more, whatever have you. We're currently updating that because in the past couple of months we're continuing to learn, continuing to ask folks and try to find answers to some of the questions that we're getting. So this is an evolving process. We've also called our counterparts in Virginia and North Dakota and those kinds of places that have data centers, have a little bit more experience with them than we in Michigan have, and asked, what did you learn along the way? So that is my confession at the beginning, is my bias is I'm a planner by training, and I pull a lot from renewable energy, which is different, but there's a lot of overlap. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. My plan for tonight is covering some of the data center basic language. What is a hyperscale data center? What's a regular data center? So that we're all a little bit closer to being on the same page. Talking about possible impacts that communities might be wondering about, and some of the Michigan policies that are affecting those impacts. And lastly, considerations for local governments. Actually, there's a fourth bullet missing, which is Q&A. I hope that we have some time at the end to answer questions, and I will try my very best to answer them. And if I cannot, then I will tell you so and jot it down and try to find an answer to share that with you after the fact. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so why are we talking about data centers? Because actually, data centers are not new to Michigan. We have, depending on how exactly you define a data center, we really have dozens of data centers in the state already. And they started from just a little IT room in a hospital up to buildings dedicated entirely to servers and computer equipment. But the recent buzz around data centers is really because of the surge in generative artificial intelligence, or AI. And these big tech companies teaching AI systems and really acquiring those larger data centers that can handle those larger queries and process these these programs. And so these significantly larger, more resource-intensive facilities are really what's in the news all over the place, but we have been having data centers in Michigan for quite a while. Another reason, besides the whole conversation about AI, and I don't think we're here tonight to talk about is AI a good thing or a bad thing, like we really want to be constructive here and look into what this means for communities. But the other reason for why there's so much buzz around data centers are the two expanded state sales and use tax incentives. So there's actually been a state sales and tax incentive since 2015, but in 2025 a new one came on. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the difference is between those, but that is contributing to why more big developers with data centers are looking to Michigan. Okay, the next slide. So what is a data center? It's technically just a facility that houses IT infrastructure. Servers, networking equipment, computers, chips, those kinds of things. An important part of data centers is really the power supply to keep it all going, as well as stabilizers when the grid frequencies are bouncing up and down. So there's a lot of protective equipment to make sure those computers are not breaking if there is voltage changes and those kinds of things. And then there are backup generators typically too, in case there is a power outage or a brownout or something like this, to protect that equipment when the power supply isn't perfect. Like you know, your phone, your laptop, these kinds of things get hot, right? And so a huge component, or like a big important part of a data center is cooling equipment to keep that technology at a comfortable temperature to make sure these computers and servers are working the way they're supposed to. And I'll talk a little bit more about different kinds of cooling system in a moment. And then the last bullet on this slide is really security systems. So we commonly see fences around data centers or gates, and the reason being is that the data on those servers is sometimes very sensitive data. Our medical records or driver's license information, all of that lives somewhere in a cloud stored in data centers, and therefore warrants fencing and security access. Even within certain areas within a data center, there are some more higher sensitivity areas. So there's commonly, that is commonly what you would see looking at a data center. Okay, the next slide, please. Like I've already mentioned, data centers really come in lots of shapes and sizes. So this is a pretty unassuming looking, office building looking data center in Southfield. You see here, this is approximately 1,000 square feet of computer equipment, and it takes around 7 megawatts of energy to power that equipment. That is that is kind of an example of some of the data centers that we already have. On the right side, you see a rendering of the Saline Township Data Center that's currently under construction in my neck of the woods. I come from Ann Arbor tonight, which is 1.6 million square feet. So it's significantly larger than that Southfield Data Center. But importantly, it uses way more energy per square foot than that Southfield Data Center does. And one of the reasons is that with the increase or with the use of AI and larger data centers, processing really happens at the speed of light. And the more chips you put close together, the quicker queries can be run. And that is one of the reasons why developers are trying to stack more and more chips and servers on top of each other in a cramped space, so that this processing can happen quicker. Also, one of the reasons why in other parts of the country you have areas with lots of data centers and they like to be next to each other, because that again enables a faster response time. But what happens when you pack more and more computer equipment on top of each other, the temperature is actually higher. And so that energy demand is really largely driven by the need to cool those systems. And so just to put things into perspective, I talk megawatts every day, but I know not everyone does that. And so 1,400 megawatts, I have some numbers actually to put that into context. But it is, let me just see really quickly. The currently largest data center is in Grand Rapids, so around 7 megawatts. So there's this huge difference between what we already have size-wise and those hyperscale projects that are coming. Okay, when we go to the next slide, I have a couple of terms, because data centers, the term is commonly used, but then also there's hyperscale data centers and edge data centers, and what the heck is the difference? So the key way of classifying data centers are either by their size or who they are serving. So these hyperscale data centers are really, you can call them cloud factories for the internet. Big tech companies store their apps there, their cloud services there, Google, Facebook, ChatGPT, all of those kinds of companies are having these hyperscale data centers. The edge data centers are usually campus sort of data centers, which we have a couple of, or are common across the country. For example, campuses or hospitals to really serve that user there. What we have seen, or what we see a lot of, for example, the Grand Rapids Switch Data Center is serving multiple different kind of users. So it's like a for rent data center where someone can rent server space to store, for example, our driver's license information. The State Department is utilizing that. There are terms, and there aren't really like sharp definitions of, but those terms are commonly used. If we go to the next slide, I brought you a table, and it might be a little bit small for me, actually, now I'm seeing that. But this is the overview of the state sales and use taxes and requirements that developers are required to adhere to if they want to get a tax incentive from the state. So in 2015, when folks in Lansing really were wanting to encourage autonomous vehicles, they figured we need more computing power in the state. And so this qualified data center tax incentive was passed. And it provides developers tax cuts on the equipment. In 2025, so last year, the enterprise data center tax incentive was put together. And you see there's a whole lot more requirements that developers have to adhere to get that tax incentive from the state. So, for example, there are clean energy standards. 90% of the power used needs to be clean. There are some water standards, so developers who want to claim that enterprise data center tax credit need to utilize municipal water utility water. And then there are a couple of other ones that are spelled out there. The important difference is when a developer chooses which tax incentive do they want to go for, they obviously have to jump through a bunch more hoops with the new tax incentive on the right. But what they get with the enterprise data center tax incentive is a certificate in hand at the beginning. They get that tax break on their equipment at least until 2050. And when they're replacing a computer, the University of Michigan is frequently asking, is your laptop still working fine, or do you need a new one? Like, we all know how frequently our iPhones, our laptops ought to be replaced. And so a data center developer, too, is replacing equipment over time. And so what that enterprise data center tax incentive offers is here's your certificate, and for the next several years, you can get that tax break. Whereas the qualified data center has the advantage that it has less requirements, but the developer can only claim that at the point of purchasing that equipment. And so if they need to do that every couple of years, then every time they have that uncertainty whether this tax incentive actually still exists. And so the point of why I'm showing you this is, one, the enterprise data center tax incentive is explaining why developers are looking here, but also is explaining, or I want to use that as an opportunity to make clear, not every hyperscale data center that comes around the corner necessarily will come with 90% clean energy, or will come with utilizing municipal water, because it is unclear at the moment to us. They're balancing certainty of the enterprise data center tax incentive but hoops, or no hoops but uncertainty. that certificate. And so, I make this sound more complicated than it needs to be, but it's unclear for local governments really if all of the new data centers will actually really adhere to those enterprise data center requirements. Okay, if we go to the next slide, what a data center developer is looking for. And so number one, and this is really where our team kind of got into the fold, is that access to transmission power lines. Big hyperscale data center needs to connect into the electricity highway of Michigan and these large, tall transmission lines. A small office-sized data center might also be able to hook into the local distribution line that is connecting to our homes in town. But access to the transmission lines is really like a number one requirement that solar, for example, needs to. So developers are looking, where's the transmission lines in any one place, and we have maps that I can share with you too to find that out. And where can they hook into the grid? Where are maybe existing substations already where there's a break in the power lines? The other key thing, and that's where it's different than solar, is that a data center developer really needs access to the fiber highway of Michigan, so that backbone fibers have quick, fast internet. It was really difficult, y'all, to find data on where those backbone fiber lines are. And so the Merit Network has provided this map, but there's also a whole lot of trouble or difficulty of getting that data. Like where exactly in your corner of Michigan is there backbone fiber? But those are the two big electricity and backbone fibers for every data center developer needs. And that is, the next thing is contiguous land. So for solar projects, it's common that it's a property here or land over here that signs up and here, and that's how a solar developer gets a couple of hundreds or 1,000 acres together for a solar project. But for data centers, it's really a contiguous piece of land because it's easier to put a fence around or to access municipal water to those kinds of things. Water, speaking of water, if it's water cooled, and I'll talk a little bit more in just a second about different ways data centers are cooled, would then also require access to water. And then a lot of times, why data center developers are oftentimes knocking on township stores is because here is farmland, cleared land, maybe lower millage rates than in the cities, which stays, and they're ultimately also looking for favorable zoning. Okay, if we go to the next slide, I forgot to say, I brought a couple of copies of a assessment tool. So Professor Gene Hardy at MSU School of Information, he has put together a local government assessment tool and asked a couple of questions to gauge how likely would it be that a data center or hyperscale data center developer comes to town. And so some of those items here, backbone fiber, are represented in that checklist as well. And I brought a couple of copies and can send you the link. I have a little screenshot on the slide so I don't forget. Okay, so what are some of the possible impacts of data centers and Michigan regulation? We'll go to the next slide, or the next slide. Thank you. How much electricity does the data center use is a common question that we get. And we've tried to look, and it's really hard to say because it totally depends on how big they are and how they are cooled. And like I already said, it's not necessarily correlating with square footage because it really depends on how packed together or like how dense the chips of the servers are stuck together. I guess that number would have been helpful a little bit ago. The 32,000 megawatts, or in other words, 32 gigawatts, is what Michigan's total electricity capacity was 2 years ago. And so putting again into perspective that 1.4 gigawatt or 1,400 megawatt data center in Sabine, you can make up your mind if that's a lot or not a lot. But I do often get the question, is this a lot of power? So we're going to go to the next slide. the logical question then is, who regulates data center electricity use and the electricity prices that they have to pay? And there is not a usage police. No one says a data center can only take megawatts or megawatt hours a year. But the data centers are locked into the utilities that are serving the territory, so DTE, consumers, municipal utilities. And the utilities, or at least the state-regulated utilities, DTE and consumers, they have to show to the Michigan Public Service Commission every year they have enough capacity to serve customers, and if they take on a big new customer, they have to prove that they have enough capacity left to serve all of their existing customers. So the Michigan Public Service Commission is really that body that is regulating the utilities. And besides requiring that annual proof, they're also regulating rates to customer classes. And so every time DTE and consumers are wanting to increase the rates, they have to get the okay from the Michigan Public Service Commission. Yes. When we go to the next slide, I think what's more on people's mind is not necessarily what does the data center have to pay for their electricity or to compete. Does it impact our electricity rates? And to be very honest with you, we don't really know. So we've looked at and talked to our counterparts in other states, and there's conflicting evidence as to whether electricity rates for consumers go up or go down because of data centers. And so there are some cases where rates increased because data centers were there, for example, in Virginia. But then there's also states where the maintenance of the power grid is expensive, but there's enough capacity to take on this new big data center customer, and now the cost of maintaining that power grid can be shared with among more users of power. And so the cost of maintaining a system per person goes down because now the data center developer is contributing to keeping that grid maintained. So to that point in Michigan, like I said already, the Michigan Public Service Commission has a rule to stick to cost of service rate making. So as we're taking a national evidence and thinking, how does that apply to Michigan? What's really unique in Michigan is that the Michigan Public Service Commission is requesting individual rate classes depending on the user. And so saying if this new data center customer class is now requiring a bunch of build out of infrastructure, then they have to pay their way rather than it being rolled over to or related to all users. So there's private residence rates, commercial rates, and potentially data center rates. And so there is the hope that the Michigan Public Service Commission really ensures that developers are paying their way rather than costs being distributed to the general public. But what I think is also really tricky to know is we have to build out a whole lot more power to even serve just a handful of data center or hyperscale data centers in Michigan. And our state also has renewable energy goals and goals of building out more solar and wind. And so the utilities will have to procure a whole lot more power, much of which clean. And if you're a solar developer or a wind developer and you know the demand for your kind of power is incredibly high, I don't know what that does to the supply and demand curve here. Might mean that there's a whole lot more demand for power, and so maybe a developer of a power plant can ask for more. My point being is we don't really know how rates would change and will change in the future with data centers, but also not without. And so it's really tricky to compare that. Okay, if we go to the next slide, I'm really not a water person. I'm a fish out of water in Texas. But how much water does a data center use? And again, it depends. There's two main cooling mechanisms, the evaporative cooling really takes a whole lot of water, or at least 5 million gallons a day sounds like a whole lot to me. And then there are closed loop or air cooling systems where you have a liquid going in circles basically, and so the use of additional water draw is minimal, or limited to just the kitchenette, the bathroom, what have you, as like a regular office space might have to. For context, we have some numbers here. So the Great Lakes Water Authority, which serves most of southeast Michigan, is drawing 1 billion gallons a day. But I think even more impressive is that the power plants in Michigan that rely on water, so coal, gas, they're drawing 5.4 billion gallons a day. And so the real trickiest thing is when we go to the next slide, we really have a water energy conundrum. Because even though closed loop air cooling uses less water on site, it requires a whole lot more electricity to keep that facility cool. And if our power plants across the state are using a whole lot of water to generate power to serve that data center, then we might not have big electricity draw in that place, water draw in a particular place with closed loop air cooling. But indirectly, we still need a whole lot of water to create that energy. And so with evaporative cooling, we have more localized direct water impacts, but they're using this. So it's this trade-off. And we've been trying to think a lot about what would an environmentally friendly data center look like. And it really depends on, do you zoom in on the host community, then maybe air cooling, less water. But if you're thinking more broader scale and thinking Michigan or beyond, then as long as we have coal, nuclear, natural gas in our energy mix, that will create water needs elsewhere. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Going to the next slide. Who regulates water use? EGLE's Geologic Resources Management Division is regulating and requiring permits for any kind of land use or facility that is pumping more than 100,000 gallons a day. And there's some extra requirements or extra permitting necessary if it's in sensitive areas or if it's over 2 million gallons a day. But this is applying to all producers, big ag or utilities, big industry. So this is not necessarily picking on data centers. This is just universally true. If the data center is served by a public utility, then also the Safe Drinking Water Act kicks in, which basically stipulates that a municipal utility has to maintain capacity and reliability for its existing customers, and by adding on a data center or promising to take on a data center, they have to make sure and are by law required to make sure that they can still serve their existing customers. So, and for any data center that is interested in tapping into this newer tax incentive, they have to get their water from a public utility. In the case of Saline Township, which the data center was not going to be served by a municipal utility, the developer actually created a municipal utility with just the well just to serve that data center so that they're able to claim that 2025 tax credit. Okay. If we go to the next slide, air quality. The data center itself, or the data center, the computer equipment and whatnot, that itself doesn't necessarily have any effect on air quality, but it's really surrounding the electricity production required. So commonly, when data centers are having backup generators in case the power goes out, or but they do frequent testing. And so whenever that testing is happening, you have air pollution. But mostly it's really when we pull power from the grid to serve that data center, depending on what that fuel type is, that really impacts, or that is really what determines where and how much air quality issues there are. Air, similar to water, is regulated by EGLE. So for air quality, that's the EGLE Air Quality Division. And again, they would require air permits for all sorts of things, and not necessarily just So again, the cleanest option would really be if we put data centers into places across the country where the power grid is cleaner, that's where, in the bigger picture scale, the air quality concern will be less. So it really depends on what we fuel our power plants with. Okay, if we go to the next slide, this is where it gets interesting as a land use person. So we really care a whole lot about farmland. When we talk about solar day and night, that is a hot topic and a frequent item of conversation. And I would go as far as to say that in the greater scheme of things, data centers' impact on farmland is somewhat minuscule if we think about we only have the power to serve a limited amount of data centers in the state. And also, so that we won't have thousands and thousands of acres of data centers everywhere. But the real issue is really, it's a death by a thousand cuts if we think about all the things that are gobbling up farmland across the state. So it's just adding to that pressure. Again, and I have to be the energy person, but again, the impact really on farmland or on land use is that indirect effect of the power plants that are providing that electricity to the data center. The impacts on sensitive natural features, I think that also goes along for much big development. If you put it on slopes, if you put it in wetlands, then you have to do loop erosion and those kinds of things. And so the impacts on sensitive natural features really depend on where you put it. And I think that is similar to other big developments. Will these become brownfields? That's a question I think about a lot. From the renewable energy space, it's actually pretty industry standard for renewable energy projects to talk and require in zoning decommissioning. So taking all of the equipment away at the end of its lifetime. I'll talk a little bit more about decommissioning in just a moment because it's really, I think, a key tool that we have and that's common for some land uses and that can prevent future brownfields. We only had these kinds of plans 50 years ago that I think are like a whole lot different. Okay, if you go to the next slide. I love how everyone's flipping over at the same time. Maya, switching, thank you. Okay, so what I think a lot of people really, really, really care about the most is how does a data center impact my quality of life? Water use, I don't want to diminish the other concerns that folks have, but this is really where I think the rubber hits the road. We think a lot about disruption during construction. Like any big construction project, you have traffic, you have noise, you have vibration, you have dust, soil erosion, semi-drivers are not going the way they're supposed to go. So there's a whole lot of disruption at the time of construction. For greenfields, really what is key, I think, is the change to the rural character or to the landscape. If you have a greenfield before and now you have a huge warehouse full of servers, that is a change. And I think what a lot of people actually are not talking about is the change to the nighttime character. So when you have security lighting, that changes how a place looks if you don't have street lights in the night. And the next one is really sound and what noise these kinds of systems make. And from the solar space, we know that how loud a solar project is really depends on a whole lot of things, on the weather and those kinds of things. But it also depends on what kind of materials are you procuring? What kind of inverter product are you buying? And there are louder inverters and there are less loud inverters. There are louder HVAC systems and less loud HVAC systems. So it's a similar issue, and for renewables, it's very common to have sound requirements or sound standards. And I think a whole lot of rural places don't necessarily have a sound ordinance in place, but I think it does make a whole lot of sense to think about industrial use bigger and to really think about sound as well. And zoning, this is my segue to zoning, it's really the number one tool for local governments to get at some of these things and mitigate these impacts. So, if we go to to, oh, shoot me, I forgot the text. Okay, before I talk about zoning, I only talk about the bad stuff. The number one reason why a local government might be remotely interested in hosting a data center, or a big one, is really not jobs, sorry, that was too early, is the tax revenue, which I will talk about in the slide after. But jobs are a huge argument too for why the craze about data centers. And so there's really a wide range of numbers as to how many jobs are created through data centers or through data center development. And there's thousands, up to thousands of jobs, but they're in construction. Again, estimates really range wildly, but there are not necessarily many long-time jobs in the community. Again, numbers vary widely, but by the number of parking lots on the site plan, I think you can get a sense for how many people actually go to this place on a daily basis. And for the most part, that's really security folks or maintenance folks that keep the computers running, but there's not necessarily a whole lot. Daily jobs, again, you could find numbers that prove what I'm saying or rebut what I'm saying, but it really depends. Where there are lots of jobs are really the indirect and induced jobs. So supply chain, the customers of the data center, the ChatGPT industry, and those kinds of things that are really booming because of data centers and creating jobs that way. And for the induced, really that is referring to if this big investment is coming to town and people have deeper pockets, and they're potentially also spending more in the community, or the township is having an increased tax revenue and can spend that on things. And so that is the induced results of data center development, both for the consumer and for the local government. This is what I was excited to talk about. Okay. Sorry that I jumped the gun. So the number one thing for local government, when considering economic impacts, really are the property taxes, because those are huge investments. And so the State Tax Commission, that's the STC here, says that data centers are to be taxed as a commercial use. And so there's the tax table for commercial personal property, and you see that the depreciation is actually pretty quickly. So in year one, the assessor is instructed to assess 60% of that equipment value, but that drops down to, I think, is around 8% pretty quickly in year 7, which makes sense because computers are not worth a whole lot in 10 years, right? So what the developer though does is actually replacing that equipment every 1 through 6 years. So you actually have a balancing curve, because as soon as added value is being put back into that facility, presumably that line would jump back up. So it makes forecasting for local government a little tricky as to what they can expect, because it's not as simple as just going down. And it's also kind of tricky to get a sense for what is the developer doing in the insides of their facilities. You don't necessarily have the transparency to know what's happening. There's a question.
Yeah. Can you talk again just quickly about the enterprise data center tax incentive and how that's going to impact this?
So that is basically a tax relief from the state. So it does not impact how much taxes the developer pays to the local government. So millage rates, this is a shameless plug. We developed a guidebook on revenue streams from renewables and provide some strategies of how local governments might think strategically about utilizing millage rates and raising them or lowering them to kind of get the biggest bang for their buck from renewable energy projects. And I think some of that might translate to data centers as well, but those are separate. Great question. Okay, so the last bullet here that you see is communities have an option to offer incentives. And you might wonder, why would I provide a tax abatement to the developer if tax revenue is the number one reason we would say yes to such a project? And if you go to the next slide, Miles, then you see why. As a planner, I am not an attorney. Community benefit agreements are really, really tricky. And so, developers of big projects usually have pretty deep pockets to provide benefits to the community on top of that. In Saline Township, the developer paid for the 1.4 gigawatt project, provided around $14 million to Saline Township in community benefits. You see here what they're intending on spending that on. But the only reason that that is actually legally enforceable for the township is because that was part of the court settlement. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act in just a second. But there's limited enforceability. You cannot require from a developer to give you a community benefits agreement in return for a special land use permit. And so, again, ask your attorney. But that is really tricky for local governments. And so, calls for community benefits are really, really important, but they're really delicate to balance. And so, Saline, in the case of Saline, this was in part through a court settlement. But the other way of having a bit more teeth for community benefits is through public subsidy. If you were to provide a tax incentive to the developer, you can, in return, request a more tangible and a more enforceable monetary benefit to the township. Because that is so tricky, I'm going to zip it here and not get myself into any waters. But there's a whole lot of buzz around these benefits agreements, and I just always want to disclaim, be careful, they're tricky. Okay, if we go to the next slide, let's talk zoning. And we have the planning history, which is wonderful, but everyone who doesn't do zoning on a regular basis, I have a little recap of zoning 101. If we go to the next slide, Miles, the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act, the MZEA, is really the guiding document for what townships can do and cannot do. And it says that you cannot ban a lawful land use for which there is a demonstrated need. You cannot ban a solar farm or a wind farm or a data center. And being quiet in your zoning ordinance about those kind of land uses is practically a ban too, so also doesn't really work. And so, but what you can do is include reasonable regulations and not have it be a free-for-all. And the more you can tie your zoning decisions to verifiable impacts and how your zoning might mitigate those, for example, found, and the more you are consistent across your zoning ordinance with other land uses and show that you're not just picking on data centers or just picking on a wind farm, the more solid your zoning ordinance is. Third bullet, I think, is important because usually zoning should be based on a plan. Your master plan is your guiding document as to what is important to our place, where do we see land uses develop in the future, what do we want to see happen in our community. And so leaning on the master plan as you're thinking about a zoning ordinance is very important. And from the renewable space, I also know that a lot of communities have to react very quickly to a proposal and don't have time for a complete master plan redo. And so zoning should be based on a plan, ideally. On the next slide, what do we have here? So, the guide, I basically just talked you through the guide that we have in front of you, maybe. With the guide includes a whole lot more footnotes and all of those kinds of things, and you can do some further reading. But at the end of the guide, we really hone in on these 5 key takeaways of what can we as a community think about or consider. But before I go through each of these 5, I will actually pause for just a second because we're currently making changes to the guide and that aren't necessarily reflected there just yet. But if we go to the next slide, Miles. Okay, 2 key changes. One of them is to distinguish between scales. That is not in the guide just yet, But one thing we have really tried or noticed is everyone puts data centers in the same bucket. And we don't want to unintentionally apply a whole bunch of scrutiny on the small data centers that we already potentially have in our communities, or maybe already have data centers in your zoning ordinance. A lot of places do, and they are not even aware. And so a key thing is really to differentiate between different scales of data centers. Like I mentioned, the energy capacity is really driven by the cooling demand. And so as communities are thinking about, okay, we have a small data center and a big data center category in our zoning ordinance, how do we draw the line? Do we use square footage as a means of differentiating between scales? I think megawatts makes a little bit more sense because it's really that megawatt, the higher the megawatt, the more impact really a project has rather than square footage. But what we've been seeing is, so the data centers we have in Michigan are all below 10 megawatts. So these office building characteristics, they blend into any landscape way differently than those hyperscale projects that are really significantly larger than 10 megawatts. So as we have been trying to identify where might this threshold be, I don't know that this is the golden answer, but it is some answer as to we're seeing these small projects below 10 megawatts, and then we're seeing these really, really big ones, and it feels like we should treat them maybe differently. And to really consider in which districts do these different scales of data centers make sense, and also which processes. Is this a by right land use that you want to permit in industrial districts, or is it a special land use where you have a little bit more discretion? The other key change in the guide that we will be making is to include a note on moratoria. So basically pausing the receipt of any kind of applications to really take time and learn about and develop a zoning ordinance. If you go to the next slide, this is the slides to see the community benefits. The moratoria are the other opportunity where I say your attorney can guide you and what to take note of. But from talking to the attorneys working with the Michigan Townships Association, and I know that MCA is working on lots of great resources on moratoria specifically for data centers as well, is the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act allows for moratoria. It is a tool available to you, but only if you this is another one where there's just a lot of disclaimers and you have to do it right or else you get in trouble. It must be time limited. You have to make progress towards nearing the end of that moratorium. It really is key to consult with your attorney on doing it the right way and making sure you're crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's so that the moratorium is done the right way. But it does provide local governments with a little bit more time if a proposal were to be imminent. Okay, so those are the two changes we're going to be making to the guide. It's going to be a good time though, we're traveling around a lot to do this presentation. Okay, back to what the community should do. So number one, and I promise those are my final slides, and then I'll zip it in and you have some time for questions. But what's the community to do? So I think that data centers is really just the newest flavor and version of big industrial developments, which we haven't really seen in Michigan in a while. And so evaluating your industrial zone, if you go to the next slide, I think is really key. And assessing, do we have an industrial zone? How big is it? When have we last revisited? And even communities that have not historically seen a lot of industrial development should really reconsider what does their zoning ordinance actually include and how do they picture industrial development in their community. Might it be appropriate to expand it or maybe not? I think the master plan, again, is your guiding document to determine which land uses make sense in our community, where is the water excess, where is the electric infrastructure, where are those transmission lines, Where is that backbone fiber? And again, I will point to that assessment checklist that I printed out by MSU to really help you get a sense for which areas in our township are even kind of on the table potentially, and really thinking about it that way. And then deciding what is the appropriate process for industrial land uses generally. Is it a by right kind of thing, or what kind of land uses do we want to have a little bit more discretion over through a special land use permit? Okay, and the next slide. I think that so much of the conversation around data centers with concerns about sound, concerns about unsightliness, concerns about light pollution, those are things that are not unique to data centers and that come up in the conversation around renewables and also other big development. And so I think it's time for us to think about how can we think about quality of life more comprehensively as we're thinking about industrial use. And having or reviewing whether a sound ordinance might make sense in your place, not just for data centers, but for any kind of noisy or unsightful or safety stuff. Screening is very common for renewable energy projects. Maybe you don't need to screen plant trees between industrial uses, but at a minimum where there's a residential district or residence nearby. And on the light pollution piece, if it's really important in your place, and again, as you're thinking about your master plan, what is important in our place and how do we make sure that it's reflected in our zoning ordinance? For all the things, not just data centers. Okay, what's next? I think the number one, this is my favorite one, one of my favorite topics, one of the key quality of life regulations, I really want to argue that for all sorts of development, we should be thinking about decommissioning, or at a minimum reclamation. So the difference, I recently learned this maybe 2 weeks ago, an attorney explained to me the difference. Decommissioning, restoring back to what it was before, taking all of the stuff out, taking the stuff out of the dirt, and reclamation, bringing it back to, or bringing it into a state where it's still usable. And if you think about data centers and technical equipment, maybe you are not going to farm that land again afterwards, but at least put it in a place where then it is suitable for other kinds of development. And so that's the difference between those two. And for renewable energy projects, this is industry standard, where local governments are requiring in their zoning ordinance a decommissioning plan to spell out what equipment gets removed. Do wind turbine or farmers with wind turbines on their properties actually commonly want to keep the access roads because they utilize those for their vehicles? So really clarify what are the kinds of things that go and stay. And then the financial instrument is the second important element of decommissioning. If, and you of course never want that to happen, but if the developer were to go belly up or disappears or what have you, it is very common to have, and you can require that again, or it's common for renewable energy projects, to basically have a financial mechanism in place that worst comes to worst, the township can take care of removing that equipment, and there's financial means available to do that. You don't really want to do that, but that's a backup. And it might not be reasonable to request the developer to put millions of dollars of cash in safe. But what's common in energy projects is a surety bond, which is basically an insurance policy that the developer renews every year and pays some money for, but it is available in case decommissioning needs to happen and the developer is not taking care of that themselves. And then the third element of decommissioning is an agreement where it's really spelled out when can the local government tap into that instrument, how can the local government know whether the project is still operating or whether it has reached the end of its life. We have a guide, again, another shameless plug, but we worked recently on this guidebook where we basically explain the development process of energy projects and where in the process are there burdens or considerations for local governments to make. governments to make. So updating your master plan costs money. Updating your zoning ordinance costs money. How can you recoup those costs? That is what this guidebook is about. But there's an appendix in there with a sample decommissioning agreement that maybe doesn't copy paste well for data centers, but at least it gives you a starting point of some of the things that you might want to consider when thinking about decommissioning requirements. Okay, what's next? Get commitment from projects. So oftentimes there's a lot of, and I think that is not unique to data centers, where housing developers or developers or all sorts of things, at least in Ann Arbor, tell you about all of the amazing things that the project will bring, and it doesn't always come to fruition. And so I think there is a case to be made to really get commitment that the developer is telling you when they run their backup generators, how they do too, that they actually adhere to that, and to get those kinds of promises in writing so that you have something to refer to. That might also apply to construction traffic roads, or what else? Transparency of water usage. If the developer is saying we're only going to be using X gallons a day, can they show that to you and create that transparency? If we go to the next slide, I think one of the biggest promises that is being made often by developers around this is this element of property taxes. And X amount of dollars will go to the community. But from those that are familiar with the dark stores problems, where the Walmarts or the big box stores pay property taxes in year one and then later say, well, actually, the building isn't worth as much if it's not in Menards or if it's not at a what have you big store. The disputes around that, and also the disputes around tax tables for wind energy projects changing multiple times, and developers now having to pay less to the local government, left a lot of sour taste in the local government now. And so we did not make this up. There's actually a solar developer in the UP that built a utility-scale solar project and offered to the local government a property tax guarantee, basically saying, we're going to pay you this. If the tax tables change, we're still going to pay you. We're not going to get lower. But if the tax tables change in the favor of the local government, we're happy to pay you more. And so I don't know that that is necessarily common, but it is a really cool mechanism that I would like more people to talk about and explore. And at minimum, you can ask the developer, hey, how do you do about this? And so that is one thing we are talking about in this strategy guide that I mentioned that also talks about millage rates. Yeah. So that's exciting, but last one, we're almost through. It's really, as a planner, and I have to say that, plan forwards. And really thinking about where are there opportunities where a data center can actually be, or fill in the blank land use, can actually be a solution to a problem we're having, or to a goal that we want to accomplish as a township. Can the data center take us there, or can the land use take us there? And so there are places, or there are things that need heat as an input. Greenhouse, district heating, some industries requiring heat. Obviously that doesn't apply to all of the communities across Michigan, but if one of these things applies to you, then that is an opportunity to identify, hey, maybe a data center, if the data center does come, here is where it makes sense because some industry. Or where might there be infrastructure to reuse? Is there a big, and again, this might not apply here, but it might apply in other communities in Michigan, where maybe there is a big factory that closed down and is idle, but there is that access to the transmission line. And how can you revitalize that property? Or is there a water system that is underutilized, and actually that municipal utility would really benefit from a big off-tier of water? And so those are some of the things to keep in mind as you're thinking about can this land use actually be helpful for us rather than just having to respond to it. Wishful thinking. Okay. With that, I'm through my slides. I talked a little bit longer than I was hoping for, but I hope we still have some time for questions. Thank you again.
Thank you for that. That was incredibly thorough and very helpful. And done a lot of the things I know folks have been hearing and seeing in their news feeds. Shall we open it up to questions from planning commission or board members? No. Great. Then we should do that. Does anyone have a question for our guests?
So I'm not an energy person. When you talk about like the 7 megawatts or 1,400 megawatts, is that an annual usage? Is that like what's the time frame of those usages?
That's a great question. There's a difference between megawatt and megawatt hours, or kilowatt and kilowatt hours that you know from your bill, your electricity bill. So the megawatts is actually referring to the max capacity. Basically, how big are you building the wires or the tunnel? But it doesn't necessarily say how much power then is the data center actually utilizing over time. And so, that's a great question. Of like how much megawatt hours or what have you, how much energy are they actually at the end of the day using? I don't know, that off the top of my head. But the megawatts gives a general indication of how large they're anticipating that connection to be.
Great, thank you.
This is a water question that I use a gallon of water, it goes into my septic tank, it goes into the ground, it grows grass, it disappears, and I understand that this massive amount of water that's used in these plants, that 80% of it becomes vapor and goes away, which is one of the huge environmental draws. Is that factual? Is that, it's astounding if that's true, because it takes it out of our land, out of our swamp here, out of our wells, out of the aquifers even, because it goes away 80%.
I have not heard this number before, and I am definitely going to look more into that. I don't know. So quickly,
Could you speak up, please? We can't hear you.
I apologize. Thank you.
You could use the microphone, that would help.
Yes. Why don't I do this? This works
Can
better.
we please, audience, we're super happy that you are here. Board and commission, we're super happy you're here. Can we please continue to talk to each other in a respectful way? That also includes tone when we are discussing and talking about these things. I know there are emotions that are involved with these. We have a guest here. I would like us to continue to welcome our guests into the community, especially when they come with vastly more experience and knowledge than we have here. So just ask that from, and not anyone specific, but across everyone. So thank you.
And I know that my voice sometimes goes out, so thank you.
You're great.
Thank you. This is too loud. Okay, back to your question. So with evaporative cooling, it's in the name, it evaporates. I don't know how much, and I don't know where that rains down or how, or what the wider environmental impacts are. I think that's a great question, and I'm sorry that I don't have a good response for you right now, but I will look into that more, because I think that's
It was one of my concerns because of our environment here is so water dependent and important for Bath Township. Yeah, huge concern. Thank you.
I imagine if you're pulling from the municipal water system versus a non-municipal, that will change that calculation.
I guess my question would be, where does it enter? Because it's not just going to be gone. It's going to rain down somewhere, or it's still in the atmosphere. But where does it come to? And it would shape. Yeah.
Back hundreds of years to the atmosphere.
Well,
Other questions?
You have a question in the audience.
Yes, speak up.
You have a question in the audience, but I don't know how you want to handle that.
Are some board members comfortable with taking some audience questions?
Yes.
Yes. You'll just need to speak up because you don't have a microphone.
all right. I just was curious about if your assessments have gone strictly into Michigan, or if you've expanded and looked into like how zoning has affected or any of the impacts in other parts of the country to gather some of this information.
especially for the water. Because you did mention that in Saline, particularly, they were planning to build a municipal well that serves them. But does that also serve the community, or is it just a municipal well for only no private use?
Thank you for those. I heard two questions.
Sure.
So the question number one was in how far we looked at other states and learned from other states. And while I did not look specifically into zoning in other states, we did have conversations with, well, what are the impacts in other states? What should we know? And again, we talked to our friends in North Dakota and Virginia. And so on the electricity rate thing, that was really a key difference where, depending on how state law works, the increase of the rates is really determined by state law, and so that is very different. With regards to, for the water, again, what we learned from our friends from other states is really that it depends on the exact technology that the developer is using, and whether there is a municipality utility in place or not, or if it comes from a well. So I, off the top of my head, can't really make generalized statements. I think in the guide there is a pretty solid section on water. That was question one, and question two was whether, if it's, for example, the municipal well serving the data center in Saline, could that be expanded to other residents of Saline Township? Could. I guess it depends on, do people want to be hooked up to municipal water? Does the developer? I don't know the arrangement good enough to speak on that. That's an interesting question. Yes.
Can you talk about ground discharge of coolant water?
So it depends on, again, what the cooling is. With the closed loop, presumably there isn't a whole lot of discharge, unless maybe, again, bathroom water or kitchenette water, because the assumption is that this is closed loop and you don't necessarily refill that a lot. What would happen in case of a leak of such closed loop system? I don't know. And then for the evaporative cooling mechanism, again, a lot of it is evaporated. I don't know if it's 80% or what the actual numbers are. And so, depending on, I think, if it is connected to a utility, because they would manage and oversee what is being discharged again. Yeah, so it depends on the cooling technology. It's a lot of it depends. I'm sorry, I can't give more specific answers.
I saw in a news story last week that the Congresswoman AOC had gone to some homeowners in Virginia who had a data center being built, and there were some water issues in terms of their water use after the data center had come in. Their water was brown, and it looked like, frankly, the Flint water that we saw after the lead tragedy there. Is that something you've seen here? What causes that? Is that something we should be worried about? Does it change because of the municipal piece again?
I don't think that we have seen that in Michigan because we don't have really big data centers like that yet to really draw from experience here. And I've seen those videos too, kind of making its rounds through the internet of murky water or water pressure issues. And there are these cases. I don't know how common this is. I don't know if it's a really unfortunate one-off or two-off, or if this, there are a lot of operational data centers where these issues don't arise, and what that really depends on if they hit a line or, I don't know. Yes?
Are there preferred mechanisms through zoning to protect neighboring residential wells from cone of depression or other water extracts?
That is a great question that I've been trying to get an answer to too. And how far Eagle, for example, is monitoring or surveying or thinking about kind of wider impacts of water tables. When you have a big off-taker here, how does that affect the neighbors? I don't know that that is known.
What about special use permits, mandating testing of neighbor involves? Is that a viable option?
I've not thought about this before, but I would say if it is a reasonable concern that you can make a case, could that potentially have happened elsewhere? I don't know. To mitigate that and have developers acquire that data and show you that data on a regular basis to observe whether there are these impacts and what would the correction mechanism be if there are. And really put it on the developer to provide that information, to have some sort of complaint resolution process that's really solid. I've not seen or heard of this before, but I would imagine that it is if you can make the case for why you put that in the zoning ordinance, and if water is important to you, then I would nod and look towards your attorney to see is that a viable thing, or to do this for other kinds of, maybe not specifically water, but other kind of indirect impacts for other land uses too. Maybe there is precedent in land use law. It's a long-winded answer.
Can I ask a related water question, since we're on the topic?
You guys are having a lot of questions about water. Yeah.
The wells that they would drill, do you know if they would be above the first bedrock or
I have no
below the
idea.
first bedrock? Because that's what determines our drinking water, correct? You have to, they well people in here or?
I just Googled that, actually, that exact question. Excuse me.
Right, so it would, is that regulatable to have them only drill to a certain depth? So that wouldn't impact any potable water or any kind of personal wells?
Yeah, the county regulates it. So basically, you can install a well if you get a permit, and there's certain requirements for the installation on that permit. But it's
Potable drinking water.
or any kind of drinking water, yes. But if you
And
have,
drinking water, right, so this is industrial, non-drinking water.
correct,
So if the well's only 80 feet deep and the requirement is 200 feet to get below the first bedrock, which is what potable water is that okay? And would we have plenty of groundwater, which I think we do, because we're bad.
So again, Eagle does require permits when pumping water, and especially if it's in sensitive areas, whatever sensitive area is defined as. And they are also, if there's a savvy developer that is drawing from multiple places, that those are additive. But what I do not know is how far that impact is being considered in the watershed or whatever.
Well, the potable, it will have no impact on us.
I will look into this, you guys. I'm taking a lot of notes.
I just,
Hold on, we've got a hand that's been up over here.
For me, it's vibration that they generate with all the computers and so forth. Have any of the other locations come up with testing requirements as to how far out that vibration is and at what level? Because if you have a residential neighborhood and you're sitting there with a constant vibration.
Interestingly, while I've also seen vibration come up in conversations, or questions as to whether it creates vibration coming up in other states, I have not really encountered a whole lot of folks in Michigan who asked me that question. I don't know.
We're just looking for a standard that might be out there.
I think for what it's worth, I think the Michigan Townships Association is working on the sample ordinance, and I wonder if they have vibration in it.
And on the noise of where the testing distance is there a standard that's been coming up in your?
Sound or noise is a really big element, and really where if you ask a sound, like an acoustician, it gets really into the weeds. And for renewable energy projects, it's very common to set a restriction or a standard at the property line. or the next non-participating property line. Or you could imagine if it is an industrial district, maybe it's at the boundary of the industrial district, right? What I am still trying to better understand is the frequencies at which different components emit noise, because humans are not hearing lower frequencies, but they can feel them. And so there are some pretty solid, sophisticated sound ordinances across Michigan that I think we could learn from. What I'm still trying to figure out is how do we deal with, especially in industrial areas, with additive sound. If a data center came into town and it meets all of the post-construction, you would specify where is the measuring happening after construction, what weather conditions have to be in place, how strong does the wind blow, all of those kinds of things. What is the ambient noise in that particular place? So it gets really, really into the nitty-gritty. But if the data set or development one is in compliance with the sound requirement, but then you have a little additional industrial facility coming into town, and they're the ones that kick it to the noise level above the threshold, how do you deal with that? I think there is a lot still to, like, how can we enforce sound requirements if it is so context dependent, and what's the weather, those kinds of questions. But there are, I can point you to a couple of, I don't have them at the top of my head, but there are a couple of sound ordinances, just generally speaking, that are pretty well built out that I think we can learn from. And for renewables, we've talked or thought about sound language in zoning ordinances. For wind, for example, it's pretty complicated for wind as well, or for solar projects too. And I think some of that could be helpful as a starting point for data centers.
Just saying that in relation to municipal wells versus private wells. Private wells, the Geological Survey, U.S. Geological Survey, stated that private wells are typically, they range from 75 to 150 feet. And municipal wells are sometimes as deep as 800 because they go through the aquifer that we draw and hit another, basically a permanent one that's a lot bigger, and they can extract more water without any problems with the upper aquifer that we draw from. I say we because I have a well too. If that answers some questions, hopefully.
Kind of on top of that, if I may, is we have a problem in central USA where farmers have their wells growing their crops, and those wells are going dry, and they can't afford to draw deeper ones. The deeper the aquifer is, the more years it takes for the water to get there. And if we take that out of the top, we put farmers out of business, we drain the little guys' wells. This is a huge problem, as we know, all over USA now, of a water shortage. And Great Lakes has 22% of the world's fresh water. And if we start draining down these aquifers, I see that as a huge problem for ag.
I think we have to be aware when we start talking about that, they're thinking about the Ottawa aquifer, the central area that's being drawn down, that those crops are being grown in areas where those crops should not be grown. They're irrigated on central pivot irrigation, which is a very rare thing that happens in Michigan. Most of our crops that are grown on central pivot irrigation are going to be seed corn in the southwest part of the state. So I don't think that in terms of farming that we in Michigan have the issues that Oklahoma aquifer is having, because there's some strong considerations of them not doing what they're doing in those areas and further into the southwest part of the country. So I value that opinion and that thought, but I think that in Michigan, thinking about rural crops being irrigated are not a practice that's really common here. Which doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about water availability for agriculture, especially for our specialty crop growers.
I read a study recently that said that the large mega farms that are using irrigation in the central plains are the ones that are actually making the
One of the things that I have seen as I've been reading more about this is some comparison information about other more general uses that we would see in the township of electricity and water in the comparison there. And I've been really surprised to see things like dairy farms or golf courses, which we may not have an outcry of people saying we shouldn't be doing those in the township, might use more energy or water. Have you all put together any sort of like comparison like that about things that you might not even know is using comparable resources in your community?
That's a great suggestion for our next resource. All the credit to you. We have some numbers like broadly here and there, but we've not actually put them together with regards to energy consumption and like how many homes are powered by gigawatt and those kinds of things, but not water. Again, there's a lot of questions on water, and I respect those, and I apologize that I cannot answer them really well. And I want to just make a comment also that I will ask around for folks, and I have a couple in mind that might be able to respond better to some of those water questions if that's of interest. But to put into context, and if the energy draw, the water draw, or environmental impacts generally, there is not one dedicated resource for that. I think in the data center guide, we tried to be intentional about comparing land uses and putting things into context a little bit. So it appears here and there, but we can definitely, I think that is a very helpful perspective. Are there, besides energy and water, other things that you would like to say? So oftentimes we think about acreage, right? It's, solar is obviously a whole lot larger than a few hundred acres of data center, for example. I don't know off the top of my head the number in Saline, but I think it's 250 acre site versus solar projects, which easily can be 1,500 acres and much larger. So putting things into a footprint context is something we commonly do.
Even things like sound. When Meyer came into the township, one of the concerns was around sound, and so we worked with them to try to mitigate some of that sound issue. But there's sound in activity, and how much activity and how much risk is a community willing to take on in order to get the benefits. But things like that, I think, is helpful to do the comparison, at least in my brain. Jason, I think.
So, as the planning commission has been talking about regulating these types of uses, I think we've anticipated not regulating data centers specifically. And so we've been talking about high-intensity infrastructure uses. So things that we're not quite clear about is where are some thresholds when it comes to megawatts that would kick in? Should we look at thresholds for water usage? Should we look at thresholds for other types of, and what would those thresholds be? I mean, a footprint of impermeable surfaces. Could we come up with some combination of thresholds that would capture these hyperscalers, but also perhaps maybe battery factories or other elements that might be kind of a phased developments to a data center in the future?
So for just data centers, I think the megawatts is the cleanest because it automatically includes basically how much energy effort goes into cooling, and so that kind of indirectly informs the water question. I am trying to think off the top of my head what other pros and cons of making it a little bit more multiple criteria. I wonder if at some point it gets too complicated. I don't know that there's one criterion that works for all sorts of land uses other than square footage or acreage or something like that.
Multiple criteria, it's too complicated.
So for battery energy storage projects, so not battery plants, but battery energy storage projects, which there are a lot of developments being proposed across Michigan too. Those make sense to do in megawatts. Solar is going to make sense. Also partly because our state legislation for renewable energy projects is written in megawatts, and so to keep it kind of consistent with that, for renewable energy projects, megawatts make sense. I would argue for data center, megawatts make sense too, but I hear you on the desire to separate it out a little bit more. Without getting too into the weeds, because then my follow-up question would be, how are these different classes or categories then actually, how did the requirements differ? Do they all stick to the same, have to comply with the same sound standard anyways, or where are you then requiring different site plan requirements or studies or those kinds of things? So I think at some point you just have to break it into different land uses. But that's a really interesting question.
Are there, so a lot of us have asked a lot of questions. Are there people, whether or Trustee Hagerman or anyone from the audience who hasn't had an opportunity, because we like to jump in quickly and ask questions. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question that would like to ask a question?
I have one more. And it should be an easy one. What's the distance that a company would not want to build a data center based on how far it is from the backbone fiber? Right? If their backbone fiber is on the other side of town in Delta Township, and no data center is going to want to be built here because it's too far away from the backbone, right?
Right, because at some point you're losing speed.
Right.
I don't know the answer for fiber. The answer for transmission lines, though, for the power lines, so solar and wind developers are obviously extending the connection to the grid is expensive. And so usually it's within a mile or two, or for wind projects, sometimes 3 miles around the high voltage power lines. But
They want that to be proximally.
the fiber element, that's a good question. I don't know.
The merit system is mostly centered on the 15 public universities, right? That's the backbone structure for that.
Can you repeat your question?
The merit system, that's the backbone of that is the 15
Right,
public universities.
a lot of that is
right?
schools, yes, and universities.
And there's a rope line right across the street between the radiology building of MSU and the thank you.
Okay, so a lot of it actually does follow highway routes. But there's also a very complicated ownership structure of fiber and internet connections of different tiers. And so there's not a lot of transparency as to who owns that, where is that, what would it cost to expand it. So I think Professor Gene Hardy at MSU would be a fantastic person to ask that question because he, from the computer science side, is just much closer to that. Great questions.
I'm going to ask another question.
You can ask as many questions as you like.
Go for it.
Are hyperscalers in phase development of their sites? And is there a concern about how they phase that out as a means of sidestepping local regulations?
Like adding more later, basically?
Yes. Yeah, say like a 3 or 5 phase development that puts the community in limbo.
You guys brought out the hard question.
It have to depend on the infrastructure that it would be provided.
So for
If we can't provide it, nobody would do phase 2, or 3 or 4 or 5.
For wind and solar projects, I'm sorry that I keep referring to energy, but that is where I got from. So for wind and solar projects, what really determines the size of that project is how much capacity is on the transmission grid. How much can we push in, basically, power. And so if the developer gets their studies back after several years of analysis of like 150 megawatts fit into the grid at this point, then the project is very likely going to be that size. Sometimes they're overbuilding just a little bit. If there's a panel degradation just a little bit over time, so that in 30 years down the line, they're still making maximum efficiency use of that connection. I would assume that a data center developer has a similar considerations where they're trying to, like if they're already going through permitting and they have that access, that they're making use of it as best as they can, as well as land access. But because data center projects are smaller than wind and solar, I would assume that that is less of a difficulty. But I think that access to how much can we draw from the power grid and how much that really determines, that could inform how big they are. And then I don't know why they would not build it all out from the get-go except for trying to circumvent certain regulations. So maybe this is where that's an argument against making scale categories too nitty-gritty, because then it might make it easier to skirt around certain classifications. Are there other questions? Non-water questions. Yes, sir.
Seems like it would be practical to have more small-scale centers with more distributed use of the waste energy for other purposes, building heat or air conditioning or greenhouses. Why aren't we exploring more of those options and maybe even mandating that be part of the project?
That's a fantastic question. A part of why they are getting so big, these projects, is economies of scale, but also to that point earlier that I made, especially those data centers that are really specialized on handling AI and generative AI kinds of tasks, they really benefit from as many chips and servers in one place as possible. And so that automatically drives the developers of these big projects to make them as big as they can, because then they can do that computing power and respond to queries or your Google search or your ChatGPT request to make you travel plans, whatever, much quicker. And so that is the incentive for a developer to make it bigger. To the second part of your question, can we make a maximum cap and say everything bigger than we are not going to allow? Again, to not get into exclusionary zoning territory, that would probably have to be really well tied to what are the concerns about the large footprint. Maybe it is that your industrial district wouldn't be large enough to cater to a very large development, and why are you setting that standard and really tying such a cap to a valid concern. But I think that would be challenging to limit the use of one particular land use. So to limit the size of one particular land use, I think gets, and I would defer to your attorney. But that's a great question. And so we have the microphones, I keep rambling, but for wind and solar projects, for example, there has been state-siding legislation 3 years ago that said all of the big renewable energy projects that can't get permitted at the local level, now the developer can go around the local government and get a permit from the state. And so I would hypothesize if enough local governments block big data centers, then at the end of the day, there is the demand to build these kinds of projects, and they need to go somewhere.
Do you know what happened to the proposal to the city Lansing? It's helped me to have to put the proposal, vote or like stuff, but it somehow got killed, but I don't know how.
I don't know how either. Does anyone else know?
Seems like a perfect marriage.
Yeah, they would use the heat,
Yeah.
heat the buildings, they use steam already.
BWL right across the street that uses heat.
I don't know, unfortunately.
Sorry. Are the hyperscalers or the data centers, do they change ownership frequently?
If this was a renewable energy project, I would say yes. Data center, I don't know.
And I guess for others, I mean, what are the risks for when ownership changes?
I think the risk when ownership changes, for example, for a solar project, is that then, depending on what the language is in a decommissioning agreement, or in a community benefits agreement, if you have one, or all those sorts of agreements between a township and a developer, that they are written, it's important that they are written in such a way that that obligation from the developer to pay a property tax guarantee, or whatever they promised and agreed with developer number one, that developer number two honors that. And that, for example, the financial guarantee for the decommissioning plan is also upheld by that new owner of the solar farm. And so for solar, we see both. We see the utilities developing their own projects and owning them. We see private development companies that develop a solar project and hold on to that for the next 30 years. But we also see private development companies that build solar farms and wind farms and their energy storage projects and then eventually sell them to DTE or to yet another developing company, because they really specialize on just the development part of it. And so it's extra important to have those agreements be written in a way that any future owner would honor those agreements that they have made, or that were in place at permitting stage.
I remember correctly, our marijuana ordinance says that the site plan expires upon change of ownership, or I might be misremembering that, but we're starting to think about that in terms of, do we expire a special use permit, or so that we can guarantee or renegotiate those agreements?
Actually, back to your original question, your earlier question, it's common in wind and solar ordinances to actually have a repowering language, which means if at some point the developer wants to significantly replace certain components or add to it, because maybe in 10 years' time they would like to add additional wind turbines for whichever reason, because maybe the transmission line was upgraded or something. You would have to really spell out in your zoning ordinance what kind of change to the project triggers the new special land use process. And so maybe that gets at some of that phase development concerns.
And maybe also, like, for the marijuana, there was a certain number, am I correct in remembering, there was a certain number that could happen, that could also be maybe along those lines, that would be a way to not exclude, but without limiting.
That's very lucrative for our lawyers.
I think there was a question in the back.
Yeah. Do you have any statistics of the decrease in property values within, let's say, a mile of these plants? I have a friend who lives in Mason. He wanted to build one of these damn things right on his section, and his house is going to become worthless from the noise and from the visual. He lives in the country, it's beautiful skies at night and all that. He's going to have to move. His house is going to be worthless on it. Do you have any statistics on that?
I don't have any, sorry, finish.
That would be a smart thing to look into. If we build one of these things in Bath, how is that going to affect the property values in those houses? Even though the township might get more money from the property taxes from the machine that's being built there, we're going to lose the money from these houses. And the poor people who are stuck with that because you can't sell your house. And the township certainly isn't going to pay them if they're not within the property where the thing is being built. They'll say within a mile. You know, I think that should be a real strike against wanting to have one of these things in your community.
That is a question that comes up all the time with renewable energy projects too.
Yeah.
Short answer, I don't have data on data centers. I have data on wind and solar projects. And I have just the other day talked to an appraiser in Michigan that has lots of experience with appraising farmland and home values and some wind projects, and so, or those kind of properties nearby wind turbines. And what I have learned in my little deep dive into into property values, is that it's incredibly difficult to separate if that house was sold for less than X, or than it was worth 5 years ago, to actually separate that from inflation, market trends, what happens. So to really say this property is worth more or less because of the data center, it's really difficult to separate that from all of the other things that are happening. And it takes some time to really study over time how the value of certain properties is changing. And so we have some national data and survey data for wind and solar projects, and the very initial survey or analyses of property values several years ago for wind and solar showed that there was no impact. More recent studies show that in the immediate vicinity of a solar and wind project, there is a dip in property values. Because the people who don't want to look at it and they move away, right? And so, and for solar and wind, after a couple of years, they actually bounce back to normal.
Yeah, that's almost like apples and oranges if you think about it, because they don't make nearly as much noise.
But there are a lot of people.
You can see pictures I've seen on TV of like data centers. I think it's in New Jersey where they have right in neighborhoods. Those places become unlivable. I think those would be the things to look at and see how much those property values are. I'm not criticizing you, but I'm just saying it seems like that should be the bottom line, one of the bottom lines of how it's going to affect the environment around here and the property values. And I think if someone were to build one across the street from me, I'd be out of here so fast, and I would pay someone to buy my place for anything just to get out of here. Destroy it.
I would add one more comment because I like playing devil's advocate. I think there is a whole lot of land uses that people prefer to not live next to.
Oh, sure.
And everyone is triggered by different kinds of things. I wouldn't want to live next to a hog farm. And so depending on the person that is living there and what they feel like is an intrusion to their quality of life.
Sure.
It could be data centers, it could be a lot of other things too. And so separating that out, I think it's really tricky.
And it's really hard with the news and stuff to tell exactly what the impact would be if they go into these things across the street from it. But that would be something we really ought to look into. It's coming, folks. We want to use our cell phones.
So, Andy Pierre?
Is there any way to include like compensatory language into some of the regulations that may affect property values? In a sense, so like as a included in that regulation, we would set up, like if you want to develop within a certain proximity, you're going to have to potentially compensate. I know you talked a little bit how that's really difficult, but is that something that could be included if they were to build?
I have heard of communities considering property value guarantees in their renewable energy ordinances before. And because that is so difficult I think you can find someone that does the study for you that comes up with result A and result B. And you can always find, I just think it's very hard to prescribe what such a study or such a promise would have to look like for it.
Could be done. Regardless of how difficult
I think
it is.
part of that answer might be how willing are you to risk going to court?
Unless that's included in the language in the ordinance.
That still goes to court.
Yeah.
Goes to court. Has to, personally.
And so then that comes with expenses for attorneys and all. So I think, I'm not saying going to court is bad, but I think it could have that consequence, and then it comes with obligations of, there's pros and cons.
Lizzie loves that idea.
I'm just thinking about Chris Maddox and how much he actually loves this topic and would like to provide additional insight because he done a lot of this and has probably had a lot of the same conversations. Sure, we're happy to take the work. There's a lot of advanced work that can be done to try to prevent that. And I was just telling the superintendent, we continue to have lots of resources on this as well that I will funnel to the superintendent for redistribution. And I will also thank Chris for maybe if and when the baby's gotten here and it's settled in a little bit, to maybe have another opportunity to come back and provide some additional information on some of these. What can we do? What are other people doing? From the legal speak, because I don't do what she does, and I won't try. Just like you don't want to be a water expert.
Or a lawyer.
It's an important topic, and you could see some of that in the Lansing data center, where there were perceptions of nefarious activity, even when it was really just evolving details coming forward. That's what ultimately caused, between the pushback and the evolution of how that was going, people weren't ready. And I think this is part of the better understanding is what is it that we're comfortable with, what are we not comfortable with, how do we manage the interests and protect the interests. That is not a one-size-fits-all, have one town hall and be done, as I'm sure you all know.
Melanie, you've been a trooper. You've been talking for almost 2 hours, so I think we owe you a thanks and give you a break here. This obviously will not be the last time we talk or think about this. Our planning commission is going to continue to work on this and make recommendations to the board, and I invite people in the audience who have thoughts to send them our way, and folks who are watching the recording, send those thoughts our way as well. And again, to be clear, there is no proposal in front of the township at this point. We are trying to prepare for that inevitability. So this is a great time to ask these questions, to propose these interesting ideas that we could make decisions on before we're making the decisions on a specific project. We're making a decision on how we want to approach this as a whole community. So thank you. Please accept our big thanks for being here. And when you come to a community named Bath, you're going to talk about water a lot.
That makes a whole lot of sense. Thank you so much for having me. I will try my best to follow up with any additional content or to connect you to people who might know better about water.
That's wonderful. Pressing through our agenda here, item 6B is items for action, of which we have none. That does bring us to the second opportunity for public statement for the board, and then there will be a second opportunity for public statement for the planning commission. If you have public statements, you have an additional 3 minutes right now to say what you'd like about any township business, including what we just talked about here in front of us, for up to 3 minutes. Please step up to the lectern, introduce yourself, and we'll start your timer. And we'd like to share the thoughts of the board.
I'm Christina Sellers. I'm a local resident of Bath and also a nurse practitioner with 19 years of political and public health experience. I'm also an active member of the Alliance of Nurses of Healthy Environments. I'm here on my own behalf, and my views do not represent the views of Annie. As a nurse working in public health and environmental health, I recognize data centers represent significant health concerns for communities they are built in. A recent study out of Wisconsin estimated that the total annual public health burden of the U.S. data centers could exceed $20 billion in 2028. U.S. data centers contribute to air pollution, noise pollution, and water pollution. They create heat domes around them that raise the temperature of the surrounding communities by approximately 10 degrees. This would affect the way crops grow, and livestock behave. Noise pollution surrounding these centers have been associated with the deaths of pollinators, such as bees and butterflies, that help our crops grow. As many of us here in Bath are on well water, I'm deeply concerned about not only excess water consumption leading to our home wells running dry, but also that the wells will be contaminated. As a healthcare professional who sees the benefit of AI and future outcomes, but also the downside for the communities that they are placed in, I'm urging everyone to consider a moratorium on this topic, just so you can bring in experts, weigh the environmental impacts, health impacts for the community. The town is obviously very interested in this and very passionate. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to address the board tonight?
I'll say a couple of complimentary things. Hi, Tim Beloshik from Upton Road again. I wanted to thank Brenda because she ran a really awesome election commission meeting a couple of weeks ago or a week ago. So it was great. And thanks for everybody again for coming. I like that you guys are having this group meeting about this important topic. And both boards, board commission, right? And I'm still not entirely positive on the big plan. Is it yours or is it yours?
What's the name of it?
The plan?
If not, call it.
So what's this one, Miles?
The comprehensive plan, to be clear though, is the township's plan. But it originates out of the planning commission and would move to the board for formal adoption from the township's plan.
Okay. So it's their fault.
We use the term comprehensive, but that is the very master plan that she was referring to earlier.
Yeah.
Just to further.
Goal of the comprehensive plan. Comprehensive plan is board. Planning commission.
We'll send it to the.
Okay. I just wanted to wish you guys luck then.
Thank you, we need it.
Yeah. You got a lot to ask in the plan. I appreciate the English person on the board now. I have concerns about
Degree, yeah.
the
Origin.
the action verbs. I think they're verbs. The action verbs that we have in the plan. We have a lot of objectives. 16 objectives or something, 40 some actions. But the actions, they have verbs that like continue doing something. Draft the plan like multiple times. I mean, Miles, you got like 9 plans in this thing that you got to develop. I feel bad for you.
It's a 20-year plan, so hopefully I won't.
Here's a good action plan. Here's a good action step. Identify opportunities. I think we can get a little more meaty in our plans and our actions. This is my favorite. I think we're going to have an action step to consider establishing. And we also have one that says, consider encouraging. We've got to do better. We've got to have real action steps that actually can be measured so that we know that we've accomplished something. So keep working. You guys are doing, there's so many people who come out to do positive things for their community, and you guys are here weeks upon weeks doing your work. And I just want to thank you for doing your work, and I'll try not to complain too much every time. Thanks. Sorry, that was over 3 minutes.
Anybody else want to address the board? Seeing none, I'll close public statement number 2 to the board and turn it over to the Planning Commission Chair for public statement number 2 for the Planning Commission.
I think we had a joint statement, but I'll take another one. Let's make it. Thank you.
All right, that brings us to item number 8, which is board member comments. I think we started with you, Kay.
I'm ready to
Okay.
take the pressure off Sherry this time.
Take it away, Kay.
First off, I just wanted to thank, and I didn't ask any questions, so I just want everybody to keep that in mind. I wanted to thank everyone for coming. The public attendance has been real light at both our board of trustees meeting and our planning commission meetings. And I'm joking, maybe we should just put data center as an agenda item every week just to get people to come. But I do want to thank the public for coming. It is nice to have people here for these meetings. And a couple of the takeaways that I hope people heard in the community, either in person or watching this or sharing with your friends, is that for the topic of things like data centers or solar or wind, legally in the state of Michigan. We can't just say no. When we've had meetings and community events, that's something that happens to me frequently is people come up and engage me in conversation. Well, data centers, we want no data centers, no data centers, no data centers. And I hope people have heard that it's not that simple. It's not as simple as just saying no. And I think that's a lesson that was learned in Saline, is they tried that, and they ended up in court, and companies like Oracle have much deeper pockets than townships like Saline. So at the end of the day, what the second takeaway I hope people heard is that good planning and good zoning, language, and updated documents are the first big step to tackling these issues when they become presented to our community. And I just want to make everyone aware, Tim alluded to it, that the Planning Commission has been working on developing a 20-year comprehensive plan, and we've spent a lot of time talking about what should Bath Township look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. If we get development, where should it go? If we had industrial interest here in Bath Township, where might be a good place for that to be located? And we have land use maps that we've spent a lot of time talking about. And by having those land use maps and zoning districts, that really helps us give the township the ability to say, no, you can't just put a data center right next door to somebody's residence. It has a separate spot where it makes a lot more sense. And so I would invite everyone to go to the township website and take a look through the documents. They're still in the draft phase, but you can find links to them in the Planning Commission packets for about the last 6 months, because we've been working on it for a long time. So if you're really interested in this stuff and have concerns about it, that's a really good document to take some time and look through. There are a lot of actions in it, but there's a lot of forward-thinking stuff as well. I also want to make a shout out to Miles and the Planning Department for initiating this process through grant money. So that's also, I think, a very fiscally responsible action that the Planning Commission has helped the township take, is by getting some grant money, I think $50,000 maybe, to get this plan in place to help the Planning Commission and the Board of Trustees go through this process. So I wanted to give a shout out to them. And if you are interested, the Bath Township is always looking for people to be in our committees, and we have a few spots. We would certainly take you. So I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and there are many opportunities to be involved with what's happening at the township level if you're so inclined.
Okay. Yeah. I'd like to, I swear I wasn't, leaning over and copying, but I'd also like to thank the public for coming. It's really great to see your faces in person here. I know people do watch it online, but thank you. I hope in the future you attend more meetings. I think it's really important to say you don't have to stay for the whole meeting. You aren't going to offend us if you are interested in the third agenda item, and after that agenda item, you get up and leave because you don't want to be here for 2 hours and a half or so longer. But please come out. It's great to see you all, and please, if you have something to say, take that time during public comment. I've been part of a lot of boards where there's public comment. I'd like to commend you on writing down what you wanted to say in public comment. It's a really good thing that we teach people when they first start to make public comment, in governmental settings especially, that sometimes you get up there and you can start thinking, writing things down. So you did a great job, and thank you for sharing your thoughts today and serving as an example of what great public comment can be. I'd also like to thank the Planning Commission. I'm really glad when we were recreation, we talked a lot about meeting with other boards at the same time. So thank you all for doing this jointly. I hope that we can do it in the future more to understand a lot of the things that were brought up tonight, like light ordinances, sound ordinances, where industrial zoning is in the township, and lean on your expertise and experience. So thank you for that. I think the last thing that I think about that we've heard since we moved here in 2008, and I'm sure was said long before that, is that one of the draws of Bath is its rural character, and that hopefully we can continue to maintain that while we move into the future as well. So I hear that from residents all the time, and I think a lot of us have moved here because of that. So thanks.
I want to thank Marilyn. That was a great presentation. You gave us a lot of information. I
Everybody had a lot of great questions. There was a lot to learn here tonight, and more that we need to investigate in. I thought it was a really good meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Brenda. I too want to thank Madeline as well, the Planning Commission, for joining us. People from the audience, it's very, very helpful to hear what is on your mind, so we can keep that on our minds as we think about these topics. The second topic that we wanted to cover tonight was pilots, and unfortunately we just couldn't put our hands on an expert for that, but I know the Planning Commission is still interested in that training, the board is still interested in that training, so we'll work with administration to find another time in another setting. We probably would not have had enough time to cover a whole other topic tonight, but know that that's still in the mix, although I know the demand has sort of slowed down at the township level, so perhaps the speed doesn't have to be quite as quick as we thought it would be, but it's still on the agenda. And lastly, if you love this meeting, we got a whole other town hall meeting you can come to tomorrow, the same time, same place, 6 o'clock here to talk about the millage reset. Karen and I will be hosting that, an opportunity to share some information with the public and answer some questions as well. As a town hall, we will not be live streaming it, so if you want to see and hear and participate, please come here and participate, because that will be really critical. If no one shows, it'll be Karen and I talking to each other about the millage. Oh, yes, that's right. And we do that every week anyway. But you all can see it. It'll be like a podcast instead of a town hall. But we would love you to join us tomorrow. Thanks. Okay.
Basically, what everybody else has already said. Thank you for the joint meeting. It was a lot of information. Thank you, Madeline, for coming. That's it.
I'm at the end of the line tonight, so they said it all. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Madeline, Chrissy, thank you for your input on medically, that's important too, and great meeting, and it's a time we start early thinking about all of this, because it's coming our way.
Sure. I'll turn it over to John to facilitate board member or commission member comments from the Planning Commission.
George, would you like to start, please?
Certainly. As always, I'd like to thank those that make all this happen behind the scenes, all the hard work behind it makes it look simple and easy now. So thank you all the folks that make that happen.
I have no additional comments.
I'm glad we had a joint meeting. I think it's been very productive. We all got the same information, got the same questions answered. I think it was a very good opportunity for everyone. Jason?
I thank the board for inviting the Planning Commission to this training event. I have low expectations that University of Michigan could do a good presentation. I was highly impressed. So Madeline, thank you so much for an excellent presentation and your perseverance through all our questions.
I was a great meeting too. One comment on the millage, I brought this up when we passed that. I've had questions from people saying, this looks like a 41% increase in our millage. And for that one thing it is, somehow you got to get the information across to the public that this is a, I don't know how to figure it out, what percentage increase is of the total millage? 4%. People need to know that. They don't know that. So I think that's one thing you could really push tomorrow and somehow get that out to people, is this is only a 4% increase, not a 41% or whatever it is. Another comment I heard is people say, in the ballot they got, it says we're going to have to reduce services. It doesn't say what services. That's another question I got. I don't know what services they are either. So a couple of things to think about. That's it.
John, do you want to adjourn your meeting and then we'll adjourn ours?
Yeah. Motion to adjourn. Planning Commission.
So moved.
Thank you, Mark.
Support.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
I'm opposed.
Board, would you like to adjourn our meeting? Motion to adjourn. A motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of adjournment say aye. Aye. Motion carried. We stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.